Hi, hello there. Welcome to part 2 of OSPF video demo. So for this video demo, our objective is to change the router ID assignments, okay, on this R1, R2, and R3 here. Okay, so this is a continuation of the part 1 demo that we did, okay, so which covers the basic configuration of OSPF version 2, okay, in a single area network. All right, now the OSPF router ID is used to uniquely identify the router in the OSPF routing domain. So Cisco routers derive the router ID in one of the three ways and with the following precedence here. Okay, so first, IP address configured with the OSPF router ID command if present. So we don't have that, okay? So we are not able to configure yet the router ID, okay? So using that router ID command. Okay, so since we don't have that, so the second one or the second precedence would be the highest IP address of any of the router's loopback addresses. So also, we have not configured any loopback interfaces on these routers. Okay, so the third precedence is highest active IP address on any of the router's physical interfaces. All right, so from the part 1 of this video demo, we just configure the OSPF on the router, and let's see, we do have the full connectivity among these components or among these computers here. All right, okay, so what we're going to do is to display, okay, so the IP address is assigned, and let's see, okay, so show IP route. Let's see first, to show IP route here. Okay, so we do have the routing table. Next would be, let's have do show IP int brief. Okay, so take note that the highest IP address on R1 is 172.16.3.1. So from the list of precedents here, okay, so for the router ID, we are expecting that the router ID for R1 is 172.16.3.1. Okay, so let's see that. So let's execute the command do show IP. Okay, so protocol. All right, so in here, so this is OSPF1, your router ID is 172.16.3.1. Okay, so based on the third precedence. All right, let's go ahead and check on router 2. Okay, so on router 2, we execute again do show IP int brief. Okay, and in here, the highest IP address is 192.168.1.2 here, which belongs to serial 011. Okay, so as with precedence number 3, so we are expecting that the router ID here is 192.168.1.2. So let's see that. So the command is show IP protocols. Okay, and in here, the router ID is 192.168.1.2. So let's do the same on router 3 here. Okay. Okay, so the highest IP address is 2.1. So we are expecting that the router ID of R3 is 192.168.2.1. All right. So and in here it's 192.168.2.1 here. All right. Now, so we have satisfied the third precedence. Okay. Now, what we're going to do here is we are going to configure a loopback interface on each of the router, and we are going to evaluate if that would change, okay, so the router ID assigned to each of the router here. All right, so let's start with R1 here, okay. So for R1, let's create an interface here, okay. So configure terminal, say interface loopback 0. Okay, for instance, we are going to assign an IP address here. Okay, so IP address, say that is 1.1.1.1. All right, so 255.255.255.255. Okay, so and now let's see if we were able to change the router ID. Okay, so also we need to change the router ID for router 1, for router 2 and router 3 respectively. But then let's check first if that 1.1.1.1 took effect as the router ID for R1. So let's see. Okay, so this would be show IP protocols. Now, if you will observe, the precedence number 3 is also in effect. Okay, so take a look at the router ID there is still 172.16.3.1. Right? So we must reset, okay, the configuration. Take note that the command here, which is the clear IP OSPF process, okay, so command does not reset the router ID. So with the loopback address. So reloading the router will reset the router ID to the loopback address. So we need to save the configuration, okay, reload it, and then that's the time it will take effect, right? So just to show you that the clear IP OSPF process is not in effect with this one. So let's do it. Okay, so say clear IP OSPF process, right? Yes. So we cleared it. Okay, let's see. Still, the router ID is on the third precedence. So show IP protocols. Okay, see this? So we were not able to clear, okay, the OSPF process. All right. So the solution here is, of course, if we are using a interface, okay, or a loopback interface, the solution is we need to reload the router. So to do that, let us save first our configuration. So that is copy, run, start. All right. Reload. Yes. Okay. So after the reload, we are expecting that the router ID now for R1 is set to 1.1.1. Okay. That 1, which we used as an IP address of the interface. Let's see that. All right. So let's see. Show IP protocol. So it's there. All right. So again, the clear IP OSPF process command does not reset the router ID with the loopback address. So reloading the router will reset the router ID to the loopback address. All right. Okay, so let's do it on router 2 here. So for router 2, that would be configure terminal. For instance, we are going to assign here, okay, so the interface, okay, so interface loopback 0, okay, so IP address, say this is 2.2.2.2, 255.255.255.255. All right, so same thing, we need to reload the router. So to do that, so let's save the configuration, copy, run. All right, start. Reload. Yes. Okay, so let's do the same for router 3. Okay, so while waiting, let's configure router 3 here. Okay, so again, when we have show IP protocol, it's still using precedence 3. Right, so let's do it. Let us create the loopback here, configure terminal. So interface loopback 0. Okay, so say this is IP address 3.3.3.3. Okay, so 255.255.255.255. Right. So let us copy, run, start, save it, reload. Yes. Okay. Now let's go back to R2 and see if our IP address on the loopback has been now used as router ID based on precedence 2. Okay, so let's see that. So enable show IP int brief. So take note that the loopback here is 2.2.2.2. Okay, so show IP protocol. Take note that the router ID now is set to 2.2.2.2. All right. Same true also for router 3. Okay, so let's check this one. So enable show IP int brief. So this is the loopback IP address assigned. Okay, and then show IP protocol. So we are expecting that the router ID now is 3.3.3.3. All right, so that means the highest IP address of any of the router's loopback addresses, if present, will be used as the router ID. Okay, so next is what we're going to do now is to change the router ID on R1, this time using the first precedence. Okay, so precedence 1 here is that IP address configured with the OSPF router ID command, if present, will be used as the router ID. Now, should there be multiple loopback interfaces, so the highest IP address will be used. Okay, now let's use this router ID command to set the router ID on router 1, router 2, and router 3. So let's proceed. Okay, now to define the router ID, we have to get inside the OSPF process. So that would be configure terminal, router OSPF1. In here, this is where we define the router ID. Okay, for instance, the router ID that we're going to set is 11.11.11.11. Okay, so take note that this is in the form of an IP before IP address. Okay, so the command clear IP OSPF process now can be used. Okay, so to use this router ID set on R1. So let's check first. Do show IP protocol. Still, we are using the router ID, okay, or the IP address that we defined on the interface. Now, without reloading the router, so we can use the clear, right, IP OSPF process. Okay, yes. Now with this one, we are expecting that the router ID now for R1 is 11.11.11.11. So let's see it. Do show IP protocol. So here, router ID is 11.11.11.11. All right. So we can do the same for router 2 and router 3. Okay. So let's set the router ID here. So configure terminal, router OSPF1. Okay. So router ID is say 22.22.22.22. Okay. So do clear IP OSPF process. Yes. All right. So do show IP protocol now. So it is now 22.22.22.22. Okay. Next, let's do it on R3. So R3 router ID is still the second precedence. Okay. So configure terminal here. Router OSPF1. All right. So router ID, say this is 33.33.33.33. Okay. So to take effect this configuration, we could use do clear IP OSPF process, right? Yes. Now, do show IP protocol. So this is now 33.33.33.33. So we're done. Okay. So let's check if we retained the connectivity among the clients here. Okay. Okay, so it's successful. All right. Okay. Okay, successful. So sometimes we just have to fast forward time. Okay, and this to this. Okay, so 3, 2, and then 2, 1. All right, and then 1, 3. Okay, so that's how easy it is to change the router ID of a router. Okay, so again, Why do we have to assign, or why do we have to change the router ID? Well, basically, router ID plays vital role, okay, so in the OSPF routing protocol. So the OSPF router ID is used to uniquely identify the router in the OSPF routing domain. So Cisco routers derived the router ID in one of the three ways, and with the following precedence here as we typed in here on the screen. Okay, so first, IP address configured with OSPF router ID command, if present, will be used as a router ID. Okay, second, so if you were not able to explicitly define the router ID with the router ID command, then the highest IP address of any of the router's loopback address will be used as a router ID. Okay, and then if you don't have 1 and 2, then the last resort would be the highest active IP address of any of the router's physical interfaces will be used as the router ID. All right, so that's the end of this video demo. Okay, see you on the part 3, okay, of the OSPF video demo, which deals with configurations, right, of the passive interfaces for the OSPF routers.